Hello and welcome to Natasha Explains It All. Today's episode is going to be a reflection in anticipation of the fact that a week from when this episode will air is the inauguration of the second term of Trump. And ironically, but I think actually fittingly, it happens to fall on Martin Luther King Jr. Day as well. This is Monday, January 20th. And I had been meaning anyway to do an episode about a trip that I was fortunate enough to go on to see the Equal Justice Initiative legacy sites in Montgomery, Alabama. And as the inauguration is approaching, going to the legacy sites made the election come into focus for me. Like, it made it all make sense. And not for good reasons, but it all makes sense. And I wanted to talk about that today. I wanted to talk about my trip to the Equal Justice Initiative legacy sites in Montgomery, Alabama. I hope that everyone has the opportunity to go. I highly recommend it. I cannot recommend it enough. And yeah, so I want to reflect on that trip and what it makes me think about in terms of how to make sense of this election and what, is going to be happening for this next term. And the punchline is essentially that Trump is just a continuation of what has always been the case in the United States, of the subjugation of Black Americans. And it feels, as I was saying, ironic, but perhaps fittingly, that his inauguration is occurring on MLK Day because it represents that tension of how far we have come, because we aren't where we were in, 1900 or 1800. We need to acknowledge those gains. And at the same time, just how much work there is still to do and how profound the forces are that are trying to bring us back to darker days of our history, right? The entire concept of Make America Great Again is to go back to a mythical time, pre-civil rights, pre-women's rights, pre-gay rights, pre-children's rights, where only white men had rights, could own property, could do anything, essentially, and were allowed to do whatever they wanted with everybody else. That is the punchline of MAGA. And the legacy sites really help paint that historical arc and see how we got to today based on where we were. And one additional context or reflection before going more into what the legacy sites entail, I was looking at a graphic today that was talking about how the Democratic Party has not had a majority of the white vote since 1964. And that's very deliberate, meaning that 1964, 1965, that's when the Voting Rights Act passed. That's when the Civil Rights Act passed by President Johnson. And really it all happened because JFK was committed to it and then he was assassinated. And so Johnson and others pushed for it in honor of JFK's legacy. And then there was, the assassination of MLK as well. So, up until that point, the, Republicans had been the pro-civil rights party and the Democrats had been, the, anti-integration, pro-slavery party. But with the 1964 election and Johnson pushing forth these very pro civil rights bills, forevermore the party switched, and the white Southern Democratic base went to the Republicans, never to return. And to this day, Democrats have not had a majority of the white vote. And it is all racist backlash. And I know people can dispute that and be like, oh, it's more nuanced than that, and blah, blah, blah. Maybe it's more nuanced on an individual voter level. But at the macro level, that's what it's about. The party switched because of the civil rights movement, because of the efforts to gain full citizenship for Black Americans. And the resentment of those modest gains continues to this day. And MAGA feeds on that resentment because it continues to play this same narrative that has existed in the United States since the beginning, that Black Americans and then other minorities are undeserving, and that they are stealing and taking from the rights and privileges that should only be afforded to white people. And in the current iteration, this plays out as Republicans pointing fingers at Black people, other minority groups, immigrants, women, gay people, trans people as the enemy and the reason why their base is suffering, to divert attention away from the true source of that suffering, which is corporations and the ruling class, who work diligently to ensure that people do not have access to quality public education, do not have access to quality public health care, that wages remain stagnant, that childcare is unaffordable, and all those other social benefits that are really the work of corporate greed. And so as long as the Republican Party can continue to convince its voters that the real enemy are the other people rather than the party itself and the ruling class and corporations, then they can use that real frustration and redirect it towards people who are not responsible, and therefore be able to continue to maintain and consolidate power and cut taxes for the wealthy, cut taxes for corporations, while everyday Americans suffer and things become more and more unaffordable for the average American. So anyway, backing up. So how do we draw these historical parallels? So as I mentioned, I had the opportunity recently to visit the legacy sites in Montgomery, Alabama. There is a nonprofit organization called the Equal Justice Initiative that was founded by a man named Brian Stevenson. You may have heard his name. He's quite a large figure in the legal world, but also just generally in criminal justice and I guess like the civil rights space. And one of the things that they realized is that the Equal Justice Initiative does a lot of legal work, and they have clients and they represent people on death row and other types of extreme sentences. And they realized that the legal work that they were doing was not enough to have the impact that they were looking for. And they realized what they really needed to do was shift the narrative, because not enough people understood American history and were not understanding the connections between mass incarceration, our current criminal legal system, and slavery, and how we got from A to B. And so they made a major investment in what are called the legacy sites. And the legacy sites, as of right now, there are 3 components. My understanding is they plan to expand to more. But as of right now, there are 3 sites. They're all in Montgomery. And one is there's a museum, and the museum has the tagline of From Enslavement to Mass Incarceration. And it takes you through the history from the slave trade through mass incarceration with exhibits, photos, interactive exhibits, videos, physical objects and things, displays, and you can walk through and experience that. There's also a sculpture garden. And the sculpture garden, as the name implies, has a lot of different sculptures, art pieces, exhibits that talk about various aspects of the subjugation of Black Americans over the course of, the entirety of the U.S.'s existence and pre that, starting in the 1600s, before there was truly a, United States of America. And then the third component is a lynching memorial. And the lynching memorial, as that name implies, is a site that honors the thousands of Black Americans who have been lynched in U.S. history, well into the 20th century. So those are the three sites: the museum, the sculpture garden, and a lynching memorial. And they, as the basic descriptions of them suggest, they are incredibly powerful. It's something that I recommend if you have the opportunity to go, not only that you should go, but I do recommend that you go with others. I think it's something that will provoke a lot of reflection, and it's helpful to have others around you. At least in my take. And I had the opportunity to go with coworkers, and that was really wonderful, particularly given the work that we do. It really helped solidify those connections. And I want to talk about some of the things that particularly drew my attention as I was going through the legacy sites, and then connections that I've made to the current moment, and why, as I said, like the Trump election, particularly being the defeat of the first Black woman, major candidate, why it all makes sense, unfortunately. And so, gosh, there were so many things that stood out to me. One of the things I remember noticing is that regarding names, there was an exhibit that talked about, this was in the sculpture garden. In the sculpture garden, they talked about how, Black Americans did not get autonomy over their names for centuries. And it wasn't, so until 1870, until the U.S. Census of 1870, and recall that the U.S. Census is done by the federal government every 10 years to get a count of the population, get a sense of who's living where, what the demographics are, etc. And so it wasn't until 1870, up until 1870, the U.S. Census, the federal government, instructed enslavers to officially record the Black Americans that they were enslaving with only a number or a first name, depriving them of the humanity of picking their own names and having a full name. And to me, that is one of the many eerie parallels to the current system of mass incarceration. And I'll talk more about how we get from slavery to our carceral system. But this was one of the things that stood out to me because, so again, for centuries, in the official U.S. Census records, Black Americans were only referred to by a number or their first name. And this was all done by the enslavers. Now, to this day in the United States, if you are incarcerated, you are assigned a number and you are referred to by your number. If you send mail to an incarcerated person and you leave off their number on the envelope, the mail won't get to them. And the dehumanization of that is intentional. And to me, the use of numbers to refer to incarcerated people who are disproportionately Black because of this history is just another example of the legacy of that time. And the scale of this was insane. So again, in the Sculpture Garden, they talk about this, the rules around the U.S. Census. And in the 1870 census, this is the first post-Emancipation Proclamation, first post-Juneteenth census, is the first time that formerly enslaved people could register with whatever name they wanted, right? They would be able to identify themselves according to whatever name they chose. And there were over 4 million newly freed Black people who chose their own names for the 1870 census. Over 4 million people, which I think helps give a sense of the scope of this. And those over 4 million newly freed Black people chose, collectively, that resulted in over 122,000 unique surnames. And one of the really powerful things that you can see at the Sculpture Garden is this massive wall, double-sided wall, that lists all of those unique surnames. It lists every single one of the surnames for newly freed Black people who were recorded in the 1870 census. And there is, in the middle of this wall, there are some quotes, or a message from the Equal Justice Initiative, bringing together what this monument means. And the last line in there says, "We commit to advancing freedom in your name." We commit to advancing freedom in your name. And that really, it was a very powerful moment for me, and again, of just like how much of our humanity is tied up in our name. And how taking away our ability to choose our name and to even be referred to by a name versus a number is so tied to this legacy of enslavement and dehumanization. And, another aspect that is discussed quite heavily throughout the various legacy sites is, the use of shackling, right? Enslaved African people were brought over in shackles around their necks, around their ankles, around their waists, around their wrists, or all of the above, or some combination of that, and shackled together and transported that way, forced to work that way. There were all kinds of very sick devices of chains and shackles and handcuffs and other types of devices to restrict the movement of Black people. And the use of shackles is standard in the criminal legal system to this day in the United States, including the juvenile system. And it's not just handcuffs. It's belly chains that are connected to handcuffs. It's ankle chains. Incarcerated people are sometimes chained to each other. I've seen it, to, transport around a facility. They're shackled together when they're put into buses to go to court or to be transported to other facilities. And to me, it's, if you talk to any prison official or jail official, they'll say it's a safety thing. And I question that because of this legacy of how much of intentionally dehumanizing the use of this practice is. And particularly given how disproportionately represented Black people are in these systems, it's so horrifying to see. I mean, it feels like slavery to see so many Black people in chains. It reminds me of I wrote an article about this for the Washington Lawyer about, the article was about various things, but one of the things I mentioned in it was, I think one of the hardest moments, I used to do juvenile defense work in Washington, D.C., and I think one of my hardest moments was seeing, there was a juvenile client of mine, so a teenage black boy, who had been accused of something. I don't even remember what it was. And in the D.C. juvenile court system, I believe it's still this way, the kids, because they're kids, that were in detention, they were held behind the courtroom, and you would have to like go through one door that's locked, and then you'd go through another door that's locked, and then inside of there, the kids would be inside a cage. I mean, it's a cage, that's what it is. And they would be shackled inside the cage, inside the locked room that's on a locked hallway. And I remember I went back there to see one of my clients, and he was there with 3 other black boys, and they were all sitting on a bench, and they were all shackled. And they all had ankle chains, and they all had belly chains that were connected to their handcuffs. And in D.C., juveniles are handled by the U.S. federal marshals. So they're federal cops. And they wear black gloves. And I just remember, and I went in there, and like, he stood up and came over to me, and all the boys, looked at me wondering if, someone was there for them. And I remember just like, it makes me, it pains me to like even think about it, remember, and this wasn't that long ago. And this is in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, that this was just standard practice. It's standard practice to shackle children and to lock them in cages. And there was just no reflection on the fact of like, if we went back in time, it's like the same thing. Okay, fine, maybe circumstances are a little bit different, but it is an iteration of what has come before and the progress that still needs to make sense, that still needs to be made. And again, it puts Trump's victory and the MAGA movement and the efforts to whitewash history into context, because this is what is still happening. I remember there's been so many times where I've like wondered, how, particularly when I was working in the juvenile justice system, like how could we possibly treat children this badly? How could we possibly think it is okay? I mean, the juvenile justice system, I don't think I've talked too much about on my podcast, but it is a horrifying system. I don't find anything redeeming about it. I could do some other episodes about it if folks are interested. Children are routinely abused and neglected and made worse by their contact with the juvenile system. And there are better alternatives that are well documented. The options exist. So there really is no excuse for having the system that we have. And sometimes I would wonder, I would be like, how is it? And particularly because it's so disproportionately black, like in DC, for example, white kids are never in detention. I mean, in the years that I was working there and all the statistics I've seen, it's always youth of color. If white youth get arrested, they're not put in detention. And they're certainly not at the juvenile prison in DC. It's all black and brown youth. And I would wonder, how can we possibly justify this? How do we think it's okay to treat children, any child, but particularly black children, given the history of this country, as not fully human? Why are we okay treating them the way that we do in our juvenile, quote unquote, justice system? And, I'm sure this was naive of me. I admit that. But there was something about the legacy sites that just, I don't know, it kind of put things into place for me of like, well, of course, this is still the case. Of course, this is still how our juvenile system operates, because they've always been treated this way. There's never been a point in American history where Black children were treated as fully human. So why would I expect them to be treated as fully children now? That is still work that is left to be done. I will talk in a little bit about the lynching memorial, and there were many Black children and Black teenagers who were lynched along with adults. Black children have never been seen as fully human in U.S. history, and I think that this memorial and the legacy sites as a whole drive that message home. And we see that to this day. Think about, again, circling back to the election and Trump. Trump, before he became like a political person, one of the things he was most famous for was accusing Black children of rape and asking for their death penalty. So a little bit of additional context to that. One of the things that he became famous for was a full-page ad. So I should back up. There was this infamous case called where there was a white woman who was raped in Central Park. And this was in 1989. And as a result of that crime, there were 5 Black and Latino teenagers who were falsely accused of this rape, and they were falsely convicted and incarcerated for years. And Donald Trump took out a full-page ad in the New York Times. And side note, shame on the New York Times for allowing this to go to print. But he took out a full-page ad calling for the death penalty of the Central Park 5, of these 5 Black and Latino teenagers who were falsely accused of raping a white woman. He was essentially calling for their lynching, right? State-sanctioned killing of these Black kids, these Black teenagers. Based on this presumption, right, that Black people are presumed guilty and dangerous, so whatever accusation is levied against them is seen as the truth and an excuse to kill them. And so the dehumanization of Black children extends to this day. And Trump became famous. One of the things that he became famous through was his calling for the death penalty of Black teenagers. And it's particularly interesting and historical parallel of what these Black and Latino teenagers were falsely accused of, which was raping a white woman, and the deep historical parallels there as well, because that relates so much to the flimsy excuses that were used to justify lynchings. So as I mentioned, the legacy site has 3 components. It has the museum, it has the sculpture garden, and it has the lynching memorial. And the lynching memorial honors those who have documented, there are probably many more, but the 44,000 lynchings that were documented between 1877 and 1950. And in the site, in the lynching memorial, they list some of the reasons, quote unquote reasons, that were used to justify the lynchings. And I want to read some of those and think again about the current context and how much these things haven't changed. So some of the quote unquote reasons behind the lynchings. Why was the Black person or Black people, Black children, Black adults lynched? For striking to protest low wages, for drinking from a white man's well, for being intoxicated, for walking behind the wife of his white employer, for refusing to abandon their land to white people, for complaining when a white store owner refused to serve him, for being accused of using inappropriate language with a white man, and for that, the man, his wife, and his 4 children were lynched, for having a white wife, for suing the white man who killed his cow, for annoying a white woman, for complaining about the lynching of her husband, for writing a note to a white woman, for carrying a photograph of a white woman in his hat, for asking a white woman for a drink of water, for frightening a white girl, for refusing to run an errand for a white woman, for reprimanding white children who threw rocks at her. And there's many more, but these are some of the quote-unquote reasons that white people use to justify lynchings. And as I mentioned, like, there is this very common thread of, in the name supposedly of protecting white women and their safety and dignity, that lynchings are justified. And that was the theme behind the Central Park Five. And it was also the theme of an even more recent incident, also involving Central Park, which you may have heard of, which happened in 2020 during the pandemic. And there was a white woman who called the cops on a black man who was bird watching in Central Park. You may have heard about this. So there was a woman who was in a part of Central Park where dogs are supposed to be on leashes. Her dog was not on a leash. There was a black man there who was bird watching, and he asked her to put her dog on a leash. She called the cops on him, and she falsely accused him of threatening her. Now, fortunately, he wasn't killed by police in this particular instance, and he was okay in the end. But she knew what she was doing, and she knew that as a white woman calling the police on a black man and accusing him, right, of harming her, threatening to harm her, the potency of that, given this legacy. This isn't over, and these excuses and this framing continues to this day. And if you want to listen to a deeper analysis about that 2020 Central Park, birdwatcher incident, Trevor Noah did an analysis of this, and this was back in the pandemic. So if I recall, he does the analysis sitting in bed, but he does a very good analysis of what that incident meant in this historical context, and how I, as well as others, see that as a legacy, right, of this racial terrorism, of the era of lynchings, of using false accusations against white people, using false accusations of some type of harm against a white person to justify using state, violence against a black person. So again, I would recommend checking out Trevor Noah's analysis of that incident if you are interested in reflecting more on that. So a little bit more on the lynching memorial. I mentioned that it documents at least 44,000 lynchings. And, unsurprisingly, the majority of those happened in southern states. But man, I was surprised to see the lynchings happened everywhere. They happen in Illinois and West Virginia and Indiana and Colorado. And, again, it's not I knew about lynchings. And at the same time, right, the Equal Justice Initiative knew that we just don't talk about this stuff. And Americans are not as informed as they should be about this, particularly white Americans. And they're not talked about as terrorism, but that's what they were. Lynchings were terrorism. And but that history has been whitewashed as, that was a bad thing, but that was a long time ago. And we see the same things, again, the same parallels with the Trump era, right? January 6th, 2021, in that insurrection. That was domestic terrorism. That was a mob of white people fueled by an ideology seeking through the use of violence to achieve their ideological, end, which in their mind was, this stolen election that they must put Trump on the throne, essentially. But because it was perpetuated by white people, it hasn't been characterized as such. It has not been talked about, at least mainstream-wise, as domestic terrorism. In the same way that when lynchings were a thing, they were not discussed as terrorism, by the mainstream media. I mean, lynchings, one of the things that the lynching memorial really emphasizes, and the museum does this as well, is just like, these are not just like isolated incidents that like nobody knew about, and it was just, some random individual racist person who did this individual racist thing. Like, no, these were like social events. These were like, many lynchings were advertised. They drew huge crowds. Like, judges knew about them, sheriffs knew about them. Like, sometimes they were, like I said, advertised, like scheduled ahead of time. And they were just, the public official would be like, oh, we can't do anything about it, just can't control the people, which is obviously madness. But you see the parallels, again, with like January 6th and being like, oh, can't do anything about it. And the Trump administration, like, deliberately interfering with law enforcement's efforts to respond to the attack. And yeah, I mean, the lynchings were public affairs. They drew huge crowds. People went to them together and their families. People would bring their kids along to see it. And going back to my point about Black children not being seen as children, many of the lynching victims were also young people, Black children, Black teenagers. And just a couple of examples that the lynching memorial talked about. For example, in 1893, Henry Smith, who was 17, he was lynched in Paris, Texas, before a crowd of 10,000 people. In 1901, in Polk County, Florida, Fred Rochelle, who was only 16, was burned alive before thousands of people. Young people were lynched along with adults. Massive crowds of people who thought that this was entertaining, who thought this was just, who thought this was important to bring their children to set an example of the superiority of white people. Lynchings were used to enforce this racial hierarchy, right? To remind Black people that you are not actually free, even though slavery has been abolished, and that a white person can decide at any time, at any place, to snuff out your life, and the law will protect them. People were not prosecuted for lynchings. And I know that in response to that, people might say, well, things are better. Like, we're seeing some of these, police officers or like neighbors, like in the Ahmaud Arbery killing, some people are getting prosecuted now. And that's true. And we should absolutely acknowledge those cases. But we should also acknowledge that those are the exception to the rule. And the fact that it's still happening, right, says something about the work that there is still to do. And, there was like one photo in the museum that was clearly of like a child, or maybe a teenager, a very young Black person who was clearly about to be like lynched. Like, he has like the ropes and everything. It's very gruesome. And he's posing like for a photo with these white officials standing around him. And that was one photo where I was like, why is there not a more descriptive caption here? But it almost struck me because it was near the mass incarceration section. It struck me that this young person must have been like convicted of something, and this was his punishment, the death penalty, by hanging, by lynching. And he's posing with, you know, the white government officials, all men around him before this happens. It's just so gruesome. And, you know, the white men in the photo are clearly not disturbed by what they were doing. And just a little bit more on the lynching memorial. There's two parts to the memorial. There's a part where the lynchings are represented by hanging pillars, right? Reminiscent of like the hanging of lynching victims. And then there's another portion where the pillars are lying down, reminiscent of coffins. It reminds me of the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. I mean, there are multiple Holocaust memorials in Berlin, but there's one, if you know what I'm talking about, there's one that's just kind of like in the middle of town, and it's a series of pillars that you like can walk through, and it kind of becomes this maze. It really reminded me of that. This overwhelming sensation of death, and just like how do we keep doing this? And it made me wonder actually if you know the architect of the lynching memorial had consulted, or maybe it was the same architect, I'm not sure, who worked on that particular Holocaust memorial in Berlin. It was very reminiscent of that. Oh man. There's a few other things I want to touch on before closing out this episode. You know, to draw another parallel to the current times. And again, the point being that being at the legacy sites made the current political landscape make so much sense. Makes so much sense that Trump would come into power following the first Black president. That Trump would come into power for a second time when running against a Black woman. And it didn't start with Trump. He's just like the latest symptom. And it reminds me again, everything that I observed and witnessed at the legacy sites also reminded me something else related to the Trump administration. This was in the first term. You might remember that during the first term, there was this viral video that went around of Mike Pence. And Mike Pence was Trump's vice president for his first term. And notably is not the vice president for his second term, because Mike Pence refused to go along with the coup attempt. He refused to prevent the certification of Joe Biden's win. And so Trump was like, screw you. And Trump's supporters were chanting, you know, death to Pence. And Trump doesn't care about anyone but himself. And so Pence became persona non grata. And I'm not saying that to like make Pence out to be a good person. He did do the right thing in that particular moment. But this particular viral video that I'm mentioning is not a good, does not paint him in a good light. But if you recall, there was a viral video of Mike Pence, and he was walking through an immigration detention center. And he walked by an immigration holding cell. This was around the time where the news was dominated by the Trump administration's family separation policy and all the absolutely horrific stuff that they were doing to immigrants at the border. And in this video, Mike Pence was walking through, being escorted through an immigration detention center. And he passed this immigration holding cell. And it was basically a cage. It was a big cage in this open room, and it was filled with immigrant men, packed like sardines. I mean, just packed. There's nothing in there except the men. And they looked like they were mostly from Latin America, and they're just packed in there like sardines. And many of them tried to talk to Pence. I remember one of them kind of put his fingers up to the cage and was kind of motioning that he had been in there for 40 days in this holding cell. And I remember that it's not like Pence ever really had, significant facial expressions. But I remember like Pence barely registering their existence, barely registering their presence. Like, I'm not sure that he actually saw them. Like, he looked at the cage, but did he like actually see the people? Did he actually register the man who was trying to talk to him? Like, I don't think he saw their humanity, and he just like walked past like it's no big deal. Like, who cares that these people are being held in horrific conditions? And also potentially illegally. I have an episode about like the immigration process, and like people are allowed to come to the border and ask for asylum. Like, then they have a credible fear interview, and if they pass that interview, then they are legally allowed to be in the United States pending their asylum proceedings. That doesn't mean they're going to be granted asylum, but they are allowed to legally be in the country while that claim is pending. And it is absolutely legal to present yourself at the border and seek asylum. Anyway, before I get like into a whole immigration thing, going back to this incident, seeing Mike Pence like walk by this cage filled with men and just like not really registering their presence at all, particularly given how much power he has as then the vice president of the United States. And they are suffering the consequences of the immigration policies of his administration. And it really made me think of like a slave auction block. It reminded me of what I saw at the legacy sites and the things I read about the attitudes of the white people who trafficked, right? Who trafficked Black people and treated Black bodies as commodities. Like, it just made me, it was like a transportation in time. Like, I could see a man just like Pence casually strolling by human bodies who are in a desperate state, and their fates are entirely in the hands of this white man who really does not care at all about them, does not actually care at all what happens to them. So, walking through the legacy sites, it really reminded me of that video I saw of Pence. And it just all makes sense. It's just the same thing. It's just a modern iteration of it. Different but same. And the progress that's been made, but also the progress that is still to be made, you know? And I realized one of the things okay. A couple more things, and then I will wrap up because I want to be cognizant of time. Two more things. One, also, because this kind of relates to the Pence point of being able to like imagine him as like an enslaver, you know, a few hundred years ago, walking past the slave auction blocks in the same kind of detached but absolutely powerful attitude that he did in walking past the immigration holding cell. I was also, there's also portions of the museum that have images of like the backlash to the civil rights movement and school integration. And there's lots of images of like white people yelling and protesting Black people for wanting to integrate into education, to be able to have quality education. And gosh, my dad's side of the family is from the Midwest. And while I didn't like actually see any of them in the photos, seeing the photos, like I could see them in them. Like it was not a separate reality. Like I could imagine people in my circles who would have been in those photos, because this is not ancient history. Ruby Bridges, who you may have heard of, she was the first African-American child to integrate an all-white school in New Orleans. And that was in 1960. She's only 70 years old. Like Ruby Bridges, again, like first kid to like integrate a white school in New Orleans. She's only 70 years old. Like she's still alive. Like that's not even that old. Like that is in the lifetime of my parents. Probably the parents of a lot of people listening to this, or your own lifetime. And it's just wild to think about this. Like it's not ancient history. And the backlash to the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s is just the latest iteration, right, of the backlash against, Black people being treated as fully human, as full citizens, of having the same rights and privileges as white people, because they've continuously been sold the false belief, the false narrative that like Black people are the cause of their problems, rather than understanding that it's a class, like there's a class issue happening here, and corporate greed driving so much of what is then being displaced onto Black people and others. And then I realized that earlier in this episode, and the museum itself, right, talks about from slavery to mass incarceration, and does a really good job of drawing those parallels of how we got from slavery to mass incarceration, and why mass incarceration is a racial justice issue, why it is a legacy of slavery. And I know I've talked about this in other episodes, and so I won't go too much into it. But one of the things that the legacy sites talk about is convict leasing. When slavery was abolished, white people still wanted to make sure that they could profit off of the free labor of Black people. And so what did they do? Jim Crow laws, come up with a bunch of like fake crimes that only applied to Black people, like looking at a white person the wrong way, or not having a job, or loitering. And then that would be enforced against Black people. They would be incarcerated, and then they would be leased. The people would be physically leased to private businesses to work for free in horrific conditions. And so it's simply a slavery by another name, and fully endorsed, by the government, who often took a cut as well from whatever deals were made with the private businesses. And that happens to this day, okay? Like convict leasing is not a relic of the past. This happens all the time, that incarcerated people are forced to labor for free for private corporations who profit off of their free labor. Like this happens all the time. So the current context makes sense. And, I could go on for a long time about this, but I cannot emphasize enough. If you have the opportunity to go to Alabama, to learn this history, to experience it for yourself, I highly, highly recommend it. And again, it's not that it's necessarily like a comforting thought that the current context draws so much from the past, but it helps it make sense. And so the clarity that brings, I found was helpful. It makes sense why the MAGA movement is trying so hard to erase history, so hard to have people not understand what got us to today, that would allow us to see the parallels in the behavior, of, like I said in my prior episode, of like the robber baron era. And then prior to that, the enslavers on the auction blocks and things like that. We can't let the historical erasure team of MAGA do that. It's important for us to learn our history. And I highly recommend that people go if they have the opportunity. They also have a website, and there's a lot of material you can learn about online. Of course, it's different when you have the opportunity to see it in person. I could say forever, I could say so much more, but I want to just end with a couple of quotes. One of them is a quote from Maya Angelou that's on one of the buildings, on one of the Equal Justice Initiative buildings in Montgomery. And the quote says, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." And I think it's a very fitting quote for the present moment because we are living that history again, right? It's a different iteration. It's not exactly the same, but we are experiencing that. But what is critical to not continuing to repeat it is to know it and to face it, right? And I think the media, mainstream media, has done a massive disservice to the American public to not help educate the public about even what happened in the first Trump administration and whitewashing that and sanitizing and sane washing him and his platform and his ideology, the things that his spokespeople say. And so people are like, oh, it wasn't that bad, he'll be good for this or whatever. Instead of being like, no, this man is like a direct threat to democracy. It's a direct threat to so many of the things that we hold dear. And it's really, really important that we not fall into that trap of forgetting. And the last thing, which is, and particularly on Inauguration Day that falls on the same day as MLK Day, the last quote. This is on the lynching memorial. There's a quote there that's from the Equal Justice Initiative that says, "We will remember with hope because hopelessness is the enemy of justice, with courage because peace requires bravery, with persistence because justice is a constant struggle, with faith because we shall overcome." And I love that because this episode is not meant to be, it's heavy for sure, but it's not meant to be, well, there's nothing to do, so, might as well just, wait for the end times. No, hopelessness, apathy, giving up, that's exactly what negative forces want. And unfortunately, a lot of the corporations and the media outlets have basically done that. They've been like, oh, we're just going to play along because we don't actually care. And we want to benefit from this administration. But that doesn't have to be your reality. And that doesn't mean that now you need to consume a ton of news and be super plugged in to every single insanity that happens, for the next however many years. That's not what I mean at all. You need to take care of yourself, prioritize self-care, prioritize taking care of the people that give you hope, the people that give you motivation to keep going, to take care of each other. We're going to need each other. And but the point being that giving up is not an option. We've already come so far, and to think about all of the people who have given so much to get to today. And we're just in the latest iteration of all of this. It's the latest iteration. And so we're going to keep going because hopelessness is the enemy of justice. We're going to persist because justice is a constant struggle. We're going to be courageous because peace requires bravery. And keep the faith because we shall overcome. Okay, that's enough. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.